So we'll begin. Okay, okay. All right. So welcome back to session 2 of our 2-part discussion of utilitarianism and John Stuart Mill. So last time we focused really on the origins of utilitarianism, trying to locating them historically in historical context with the development of the modern world, as it were, talking about the radical transformations that take place, more or less. I sort of gave a preliminary date just to sort of centralize the issue and localize it as 1500 being a time of radical transformation from the medieval world to the modern world. Obviously understanding that nothing happened specifically in that year, but if you see that as just to get a handle on this transformation, we can talk about the things that were beginning to take place in terms of the development of trade and commerce, the increasing then the development of technology, the development of the scientific revolution, the development of the revolutions in modes of thought that we are talking about, which gave rise, for example, to the challenge of the in total control of thought by the church, with the challenge of the Protestant Reformation. Right? And then this really radical transformation takes place over a period of several hundred years, with the emergence, as it were, of a mercantile and trading class, increasingly challenging established structures of authority socially and politically and intellectually, right? Giving birth to what you might call the capitalist market revolution in trade and commerce, the emergence of a middle class, the emergence of what becomes the modern world. In that process, which is several hundred years and fraught with controversy and challenge and political struggles and military struggles. I mean, the 30 Years' War, we have to go into all that. The point is that what begins to emerge in the late 17th and into the 18th century is the emerging power of the mercantile or merchant classes, the middle classes, as we tend to call them, right? And a sense of the capacity, the possibility through technological development and initiative, entrepreneurship, as we often refer to, of the improvement of human condition, where it becomes increasingly a matter that we can make a difference in the world, right? And then we're confronted with inherited traditions which are impediments to that making that difference, right? But how do we evaluate what will lead to the improvements that are increasingly seen as possible as the result of the development of technology, the development of new ways of organizing production, distribution, and exchange, right? And it's in that process that there's a transformation, one, in the source of legitimate authority. We talked about that in a couple of ways, where increasingly one begins to look to experience, right? We look toward experience and we look toward the consequences of our engagement with it. And that's where the notion of utility emerges. And in that process, there is a transformation also in the very way in which there is an understanding of nature. Nature for the Middle Ages, going back for over 1,000 years, was basically a fallen nature expressed by the notion of original sin. And we talked about that last time also to some extent. And what emerges is a sense that, well, wait a second, if this world is God's creation and we are God's creation, then would God have given us natural desires which were not worthwhile, not legitimate, not justifiable. And you developed in the late 17th into the early 18th century, a much more positive sense about the natural, not simply a fallen nature of corruption, that human nature is, that all natural desires of the human being are evil. Quite the contrary. Now that's a complicated struggle that takes place, but that transformation of the source of authority from the Bible, from revealed traditions, from the ancient sources, as it were, looking backward to a way of looking forward to the possibilities of improving the quality of life based on looking to experience. So that is one radical transformation. And then the second one being this transformation of the conception of the natural, that the natural is not simply the corrupted world, which we have to repress, deny, and only by the repression and denial are we justified and can hope for grace and salvation and eternal life, but rather the natural can be increasingly can be seen as something positive. These are the frameworks, as I said, within which an emerging concern with the consequences and with then some way of clearly and specifically evaluating those consequences. And that comes to, takes place in all kinds of areas, but it's clearly taking place in business issues. How do you know how do you most effectively produce what is needed to be produced, under what conditions, with what market? These are all practical questions that are evaluated by the success with which your engagements are rewarded, as it were. So that consequences become an essential element of the evaluation of activities. It's in that context that social institutions are also evaluated. So we look at Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, as the one who systematizes and first gives expression systematically to the notion of utility as the fundamental notion. And utility means the consequences, but it's also particular consequences. It is the consequences with respect to human happiness. Nothing wrong with human happiness, quite the contrary. That's part of this new world where the natural is not the fallen, the evil, but rather is the conditions which we have, which it is right and just for us to seek to fulfill, to satisfy. So we talked about that, and then Bentham spends his life to try to put to work a mode of thinking which systematizes a process that critically reorganizes society, so that we should not simply be doing the things the way we've been doing them, regardless of their consequences. We should look to the institutions and say, how do these institutions function? He's particularly concerned with reform of prisons and with the criminal justice system. And there's no justification for making people suffer. The only justification for making people suffer is if that suffering is necessary to stop them from doing bad and making others suffer, and serves as a process by which they can be rehabilitated and others can learn that this is not a constructive way to operate. So Bentham was fascinating, interesting. He was a strange individual, but he was really quite intelligent and quite totally engaged in his entire life in trying to find ways of thinking and practices which can make a practical and observable and provable difference in the lives of human beings. That's the framework. And the way he formulates it is that everybody seeks to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So he's purely that's called a psychological hedonist. right? If you want a phrase for that, namely that that is our motivation. We seek to maximize pleasure, minimize pain, and the moral injunction that comes forth is that we should pursue the greatest happiness for the greatest number, with everyone counted as one and no one counted as more than one. That's the general injunction. And he thinks that is a coherent ethical perspective, which is rational, scientific, objective, and in some sense provable. We can see it in our experience. We can evaluate it. And up until now, what we've had is ways of thinking about what to do, which is based on what? Based on tradition, based on illusion, based on issues like natural right. What does that mean? All right. What does natural right mean? Where do we get such rights? Are they revealed by whom to whom? How do we interpret them? How are they useful as guides? And are they not just used as justifications for the entrenched traditions and the entrenched classes and the entrenched values by which we are not really advancing the quality of life of the vast majority of people? So it's a reform strategy. And Bentham was at the center of what it comes to be called the philosophical radicals, seeking, for example, changes in the actual prison situations, the criminal justice law, very much interested in modifying and changing codes of law, in improving, in using, as it were, a scientific methodology as he understood it. So that's the framework. We talked about that last time, and I just do that to set us for then John Stuart Mill, who is in some sense one might say the beneficiary, though it's an ambiguous legacy that he had, of the work of Bentham and his father, John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill, who became sort of Bentham's right-hand man, as it were, or aide-de-camp, or secretary, as it were, starting in 1808. And James Mill saw his son, John Stuart, in part as an opportunity to experiment in the theory that they had, that it was basically experience and upbringing which determined your character traits, and that in some sense, the human being was like a blank slate. John Locke referred to him as human beings as a tabula rasa, like a blank slate to be written on. So this is the developing empirical tradition. We don't have a fixed nature in this empirical tradition developing primarily in the British Isles in the 17th and into the 18th century. And Locke is an excellent expression of that. Locke is an extremely important figure if one wants to understand the mindset of the 17th and the 18th century. And also it's very important actually for understanding the mindset of the so-called founding fathers of the American Revolution. Locke, in some sense, the two people who sort of hover over the intellectual world of the late 17th and throughout much of the 18th century are John Locke and Isaac Newton. So Locke is profoundly influential. His second treatise on civil government plays a significant role in shaping the thought which gives birth to our Declaration of Independence. I mean, it's Locke who talks about life, liberty, and property as the rationale for government, and Jefferson transforms that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's an interesting transformation there, which we won't go into here. But that notion is that the human being is an almost infinite potentiality. So James Mill puts to work his educational theory. Experience and upbringing is what determines the quality and character of an individual, and subjects his son, John Stuart, to one of the most astounding educational experiences and experiments, as it were. And without going into great detail, and Mill writes about this extensively in his brilliant autobiography, is well worth reading, which he wrote many years later retrospectively. But he was reading he was reading Greek at the age of 3. He was reading Latin by the age of 8. He was reading he read all of the classics, right? And into his early teens, he mastered the classics. He mastered basically English literature, Latin literature, Greek literature, mathematics, and he was responsible for teaching his siblings while he was being trained and educated by his father. He was responsible for the education of his siblings. Remarkable education for John Stuart Mill, which led famously by the age of, as it were, 20, to what is often called a nervous breakdown, and a sense that he would ask himself, if I succeeded in all of the things that I seek to accomplish as a utilitarian, would that fulfill me and satisfy me? And his answer was no. And what is it lacking in his life? And he was, from his own reporting, saved from or transformed from this sense of meaninglessness by his encounter with the Romantic poets, most particularly Wordsworth, and drawing the conclusion that the Enlightenment education that he got from his father, which was a culmination of the 18th century Enlightenment, was brilliant scientifically and rationally, but lacked the emotional dimension and sensitivity to which he was opened up by his access to Wordsworth, Coleridge, Carlyle, the Romantic movement, as it were, and that revived him in some way. That's a fascinating story, complicated story, and we can't go into further into here. But Mill is, in some sense, clearly he was the most significant philosopher of the 19th century, certainly in the British world, and you might say in the English-speaking world. There might be some challenge to that from a couple of American philosophers, most particularly Charles Sanders Peirce and William James, though we could see them as really having their major influence so well late into the 19th and into the 20th century with the development of American pragmatism, and that's another story which we can't explore here. But there's something, to me anyway, there is always something so moving and something fundamentally decent about John Stuart Mill, something fundamentally humane, a sense of a person struggling honestly from the depth of his being to do well, to improve the conditions of life of society, of all people. He is famous, and I will not go into it here in detail, but he's famous in arguing systematically, comprehensively, more so than anyone else, in addressing the condition of subservience of women in the 19th century. And his systematic sense that the condition of women was a form of institutionalized slavery. And for the 2 years, 2.5 years, basically 2 years, that he was actually a member of parliament, didn't get reelected, 1865 to 1868, roughly, I think is the period of time. He tried to introduce legislation which would replace the word man as voting with person. He did not succeed. So his essay on the subjugation of women is really quite brilliant. And in some sense, you read it now and you say, well, obviously, but it was not obvious then. It was remarkable, comprehensive, and it follows from his sense of what is the obligation and possibility of a human being, and seeing no rational reason why what we're saying and what we're going to discuss here in for males should not also directly be appropriate for females. And the same argument he uses for addressing the problem of Negro slavery. So he's a remarkable individual, a sort of a prince of philosophers. And whenever I read his life, there's always this profound sadness because, and part of it is, I think, that he would never really develop the emotional richness that he came to recognize as important, but I think probably was in some ways limited in his capacity to fully experience as a function of his upbringing. But he encountered Harriet Taylor in 1830. I don't remember offhand now. I think it was a social event. And he and she developed this relationship of deep, deep respect and mutual affection. And it was clearly an emotional commitment as well as an intellectual commitment of remarkable depth. So he encountered her when he was 24. The problem was that Harriet Taylor was married, and this was Victorian England. They carried on this relation, supposedly platonically, as far as we know, probably was, given Mill's sense of morality and Harriet Taylor's sense of morality. And her husband was comfortable with that in the appropriate lifestyle. They were totally respectful of the appropriate norms and conventions, but it was not acceptable to the vast majority of friends and family. So he got a lot of problems. And to understand some of the motivation behind On Liberty, you have to appreciate the extent to which both of them suffered from the opprobrium of the impropriety of this relationship, which was open and public. And it carried on for 19 years until her husband died in 1849. And appropriately, they did not marry until 1851 to respect this. I mean, there was the sense of the constraints of Victorian morality deeply felt individually and socially. And you have to appreciate that when you read On Liberty, because we'll come back to that, hopefully, see what we can. But I think it's important to appreciate. And then they did marry in 51. And unfortunately, she died in 58. They had 7 years together. And I am always moved, and I want to read to you. This is the dedication to On Liberty, which was then published in 1859, shortly after she died, and he claims really basically it was their joint product and nothing really was changed after her death. And one should say also, she died when they were traveling in southern France in Avignon. He bought a house right near the cemetery. It always chokes me up, I must say. He bought a house next to the cemetery and lived there the rest of his life, even while he was running for office and a member of parliament in 1866. He was still basically living in Avignon. You could do that in Britain at the time. And he worked closely in a lot of his work in later years with Harriet Taylor's daughter from the previous marriage. We don't have pictures of Harriet Taylor. I've never seen them, but I've seen him with her daughter. And I think her daughter had some significant role in publishing his works after his death. Right? And he is buried next to her. So here's what he says. It always moves me. What can I tell you? This is a dedication to her a year after her death when On Liberty is published, which is perhaps the greatest work in liberal political theory that's probably ever been written. To the beloved and deplored memory of her who was the inspirer and in part the author of all that is best in my writings. The friend and wife whose exalted sense of truth and right was my strongest incitement and whose approbation was my chief reward. I dedicate this volume. Like all that I have written for many years, it belongs as much to her as to me, but the work as it stands has had in a very insufficient degree the inestimable advantage of her revision. Some of the most important portions have been reserved for a more careful re-examination, which they are now never destined to receive. Were I but capable of interpreting to the world one half the great thoughts and noble feelings which are buried in her grave, I should be the medium of a greater benefit to it than is ever likely to arise from anything that I can write, unprompted and unassisted by her all but unrivaled wisdom. It always moves me a lot. I feel the sadness of the suffering. He was absolutely disconsolate. So I think it's just appreciate that, and just there's something very decent about, even though Friedrich Nietzsche did not have much respect for John Stuart Mill, but then Nietzsche was his own kind of person. So let me talk briefly about John Stuart Mill. I want to speak primarily about the utilitarianism. That's the book in which he sort of sets forth his understanding of the theory of Bentham, revised, expanded, and I think made more sophisticated than Bentham had, the more encompassing vision. And then his doctrine of On Liberty, which is an effort to try and understand the conditions under which society, when and where society is justified in constraining the liberties of individuals, and when and where it is not, and why. Hopefully we can make little sense of that, of both of those. So let me begin that discussion of Mill, though, by situating him in the Western philosophical tradition, and particularly in the British empirical tradition. He is part of that empiricist tradition, and we talked about that a little last time also. And that means that for him, the source of information is experience. And he is extremely concerned about any effort which tries to suggest that legitimate modes of thought and legitimate truths can be excogitated from the human mind itself, as is sometimes developed by the more rationalist tradition, which sees the human mind as the capacity using its reason to explore, develop, or even reveal fundamental truths. He is very critical of that and untrustworthy of that, and sees that, what he calls intuitionism, and there are many versions of that, but they're basically the claim that some knowledge comes from someplace else other than experience. So Mill is fully committed to empiricism, the notion that experience is the source of our knowledge. And for him, that means, in a very specific sense, the psychological notion of association, that we get sensations come in, and those sensations, by the law of association, in accordance with resemblance and contiguity in space and time of the input, get coordinated in some sense, a little bit like Newtonian cause and effect operating in the mind, if you can think of that. That, in other words, that the sensations come in as individual inputs and are associated more or less automatically insofar as they are related to resemblance and contiguity in space and time. They come in at the same time, one after the other, so they get linked up. So it's almost a kind of mechanical, the law of association. So he's a psychological associationalist, okay? It's important to think that. I mean, I think it's a very limited theory of psychology, part of the critique of William James in the Principles of Psychology. It's a critique of this kind of associationalism. But that's not here. It is consistent, though, with the more or less with the views of John Locke and David Hume and the British empirical tradition. And it is clearly this empirical sense that all of our information comes to us through the senses, through our encounter with experience, and then more or less these laws of association operate in the mind to link ideas together, and complex ideas come out in more or less that way. That's the fundamental dynamic of the mind, which then, as they get more sophisticated, can be reorganized and rearranged in the mind in accordance with rational analysis. Obviously, that would be necessary for a scientific theory. So you have this empiricist conception, critical of the rationalist tradition and any versions of it, seeing them in part, and this criticism is a scientific criticism, philosophical criticism, but it's also a political one, because he sees that kind of intuitionism, that kind of sense that the mind is capable of having access to truths independent of experience. Therefore, those truths are not therefore capable of being criticized by experience and evaluated by experience. They're not subjected therefore to objective scientific critique, and they become the justification for all forms of inherited institutions and oppressive situations. And part of the whole notion of the philosophical radicals who are trying to revise society in the light of scientific understanding and rational analysis, so as to reorganize society in a way as to enhance the well-being of people, see this kind of, he calls it intuitionism or rationalistic approach to knowledge as a way of allowing inherited institutions to justify their continued existence, regardless of their consequences and their injustices. Right? So there's a political dimension that's very important. But the critique is not a political critique per se. In the first sense, it's a critique, a scientific critique. And he offers a theory of science as to how we get true and reliable ideas, and ultimately, how does science advance, develop, and produce its theories that are justified. And he writes, The System of Logic is one of the earliest books he writes. And he writes as a philosopher, as an epistemologist and metaphysician, and develops the conception of the ways in which empirical knowledge is developed. Let me see if I can just give you the so-called 4 canons of induction. See, true knowledge comes not from deduction. Deduction is useful as an instrument, but deduction itself is only spelling out truths which are the initial premises. But where do you get your initial premises? Where do you get your general theories from which you can then deduce the consequences? For Mill, those theories, scientific theories, general theories, like Newton's law of universal gravitation, they are not revealed, they're not accessible to the human mind in and of itself. They come from experience by looking at events and seeing how events are coordinated. And that's where they come from induction from experience. And there are basically significant ways that legitimate inductions can take place. And he develops these classic notions, the 4 canons of induction. I won't go into great detail about them. I'll list them for you. And one is the method of agreement, which simply means, if an event only happens, if event A only happens when cause A is there, right? Then we can say cause A causes event A, right? Then is the method of difference. If every time event A happens, cause A, let's say every time an event happens, B is not there beforehand, then clearly B can't be the cause of it, right? That's simply. Then you can use the method, what he calls the method of agreement and difference, where you have one, whenever A happens, let's say whenever A happens, B happens, and you say, well, let's take away A. Does B not happen? Well, if that happens, then you suggest that's the agreement. That's the method of agreement and disagreement. That's just a combination of the first two. Then there's the method of residues, and there's the method of concomitant variations. I have to go into great detail. Concomitant variation simply means as A gets more, then the cause increases, then the result increases. As the event gets less, the result is less. So there's a concomitant relation between cause and effect. But what he's simply trying to do is systematize the ways in which events are related to events. And basically, what is a scientific theory ultimately? It is, for him, basically, this is really also Hume, basically it is simply a pattern of relations between events. They happen in some kind of regular way. When under these conditions, this happens, and this condition. Now, it's not clear if we have a more detailed explanation of why that's the case or not. And in most of the time, there really is not much significant theoretizing as to what is linking those two, the cause and effect, as it were. It's more or less simply a matter of the constant conjunction of them, right? And now there is a problem, which I won't go into in greater detail here, between the coordination and a causal explanation of events. Those are not fully identical. One could see a coordination of events, right? But is there a reason why? Can one explain why B follows for A, or just that B always follows from A? That's basically the theory that Hume initially develops, and by and large, that's central to the empirical tradition. And Mill is an exponent of that. So that what is therefore a scientific theory? It is a statement of the constant conjunction between cause and effect. It is no explanation why the effect follows from the cause. Is there some intrinsic mechanism? That is, in some sense, that's taking the step that Newton refused to take earlier, not feigning hypothesis. I don't know. Experience does not show me a cause, says David Hume. We don't see a cause. All we see is one event happening and another event happening. And insofar as we're an empiricist, we do not, to use Newton's expression, feign hypotheses. We don't impute to reality that which we do not see. And there's a long empirical tradition, goes right into the 20th century, and through Ernst Mach, through the logical positivists to this very day, of theorists in the philosophy of science who say that we are not justified in going beyond the linking of events in experience. And then there's another tradition, the so-called realist tradition, which tries to feel that where there is justification in developing some kind of theory, which in some sense explains why that happens.
It's just kind of recognizing a pattern, but not saying why. You know, I put the key in the car, I turn it, and the car starts, but I don't know the mechanism that makes that happen.
Right. That's a good model of it, right? But at some point, the empiricist says we know that, we know those experiences because the science is much more sophisticated and developed than that. And yes, so we can see all the processes, right? But we don't know some intrinsic mechanism of the natural world other than, you can make hypotheses, you can make theories, you can go explanations. And are we justified in doing that? And on what basis? If our knowledge only comes from experience, it is in some sense overstepping the bounds of legitimate conclusions to explain something which we do not understand or see. What kind of evidence is legitimate and what kind of evidence is overstepping that? So that's a complicated question, about unobserved realities, for example, and unobserved processes. And that discussion goes on to the present day. Mill is very clearly an empiricist who believes in what is often called atomic individualism. The world is made up of particular things. Those particular things interact in different ways, and we experience them, and we can coordinate at an initial level. We do it automatically through the laws of association, where we see A and then B, and they resemble each other, so we connect them, or they are contiguous in time and space, so we connect them. And a lot of that goes on naturally in the brain. And then we can develop and elaborate those connections. And the law and the four canons of induction suggest the ways we can legitimately do it and what we need to look for. Do we find that every time B happens, A has happened before? Then that suggests that A has some causal relation for B. It suggests it. If B happens and A is not there, that suggests that A is not causally related to B, and so forth. So that's the canons of induction. But from Mill's point of view, as an empiricist, that's the only way we get information, and we're only allowed to and legitimately can develop those coordinations. And obviously with scientific experimentation, we can make this very sophisticated. And Mill was totally into the development of the sophisticated process by which science can develop. And for him, the natural sciences and the social sciences have the same methodology. So he's very much promoting and expanding the development of the social sciences, but totally as an empirical investigation on the same level as the natural sciences, with nothing unique or specific to the social sciences. Well, that's the framework for Mill's discussion. And that leads us, for our purposes here, to the utilitarianism. It's in that context, as an empiricist, believing that human beings are single individuals. In fact, society is nothing but a collection of individuals. Mill does not suggest that there's some intrinsic social dimension to our lives. In this case, he was connected and in contact, for example, with the founder of sociology, Auguste Comte, who believed that society had somewhat of an autonomous existence. Without going deep, Mill rejected that. Society is simply a collection of individuals, each one motivated by the psychology of the individual, operating primarily in accordance with the laws of association and operating also in accordance with, good old Bentham here, the search for happiness. What Mill does, though, is he thinks that Bentham was limited in his imagination and his sensitivity. Here's the influence, as it were, of the Romantic movement into Bill's life that I mentioned before. The human being is not simply a quantitative pleasure machine. I don't want to be too critical of Bentham, who was an extremely interesting and fascinating and important figure. But Bentham's conception of human motivation is really not much more sophisticated than we seek pleasure. Happiness is pleasure, and pleasure really is sensual pleasure, essentially. Okay? The word pleasure is very ambiguous, and happiness is very ambiguous. We have to talk a little bit about that. But in the most basic sense, Bentham says pleasure is pleasure, which means it is basically a feeling that one has. And as he says one place, pushpin is as good as, I don't remember what the alternative was, opera. I don't know what he says. Pushpin was a little game that kids played. The point being, there's no qualitative difference in the pleasures. It's simply a question of, and then for Bentham, there was the philosophic calculus, which I mentioned last time, which is simply a way of saying there are different ways of quantifying sensual pleasure or the sense of the feeling, right? There can be intensity, duration, propinquity, extent, etc. And I listened to those last time. I could do that again if you wanted, but the point being, it's quantitative. How much pleasure, for how long, with what likelihood of it being continued, or what likelihood of negative pleasure following, and for how many people. So it does matter the extent of pleasure. It's not just pleasure for you with one individual. The moral demand is everybody's pleasure should count as the same, but it's a quantitative thing, and all one wants in some sense is an objective analysis so you can make a scientific judgment, because the problem is, up until now, people just argue about moral issues, but there's no way to make a decision between your values, and this, you say this is your religious truth, this is your religious truth, this is your natural right, this is your natural right. We make no progress. What we want is a rational basis. This is Bentham's argument. Objective basis, we can evaluate different alternative strategies. For example, the criminal justice system, and say, this one has better results. Well, how do you evaluate results if it's a matter of just impression, or it's a matter of what you value for natural rights, self-revelation, etc.? No, we have an objective standard. That was Bentham's effort. And it's admirable in many ways. But it's purely quantitative. And for him, that's what, so happiness is what everybody seeks, but happiness is pleasure, and pleasure is basically the sensual feeling that one gets, or the satisfaction one psychologically gets. There's no extensive discussion of the sophistication of the human psyche and what is involved in that. In the development of utilitarianism into the 19th and 20th centuries, as these get developed in more complicated ways, for example, the most famous modern utilitarian today, this time, is Professor Peter Singer, a very brilliant, I think he's at Princeton, I'm not sure, forgot now. But when you start getting involved in trying to say, well, let's incorporate a more sophisticated conception, complicated, of human motivations, it gets a little more complicated than that. Mill was not satisfied with this quantitative interpretation of pleasure, saying, yes, human beings seek happiness, but happiness is a more complicated thing. And if if we in ordinary life often make all kinds of decisions about different qualities of things, why should we not also be talking about different qualities of pleasures? And suggesting that we cannot simply treat all pleasure as simply the same in quality and simply a difference in quantity, that there are qualitative differences. The famous expression of John Stuart Mill in this context: it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Famous expression. If you get nothing out of the class, you walk out and say, I'll remember that. Right? And that's meant to suggest that there's something more interesting and significant and complicated about human experience than simply the quantity of pleasure. There are qualitative differences. Of course, once you get into qualitative differences, it becomes a little more difficult to say then, well, how does one compare different pleasures with respect to quality? Where is there an objective criteria by which one can determine qualitative differences? And how does one compare or contrast qualitative differences with quantitative differences? How many pushpin satisfactions are equivalent to how many opera experiences? It's complicated. It does raise some questions. Is Mill, in some sense, no longer utilitarian, certainly in a tradition, strict Benthamian sense, because he is bringing this notion of quality in, and then this brings in, you might say, subjective dimensions, which are not easily scientifically determined in quite such a practical way. And yet it seems that he does have an appreciation of the complexity of human experience. And the issue of pleasure gets very complicated because it's not clear what one means when one talks about pleasure. And there is a version of modern utilitarianism which replaces the notion of pleasure with the notion of satisfaction, and says that it really matters, and what we evaluate is the greatest happiness to the greatest number, where one means the greatest, creating the greatest possibility for human beings to satisfy that which they desire. Understanding that human desires are vastly different. I'm not going to explore that, but we can see how one can take this notion of what is it that a human being wants. Mill insists that human beings want happiness, and insofar as they want freedom or well-being or wealth, they really want it as part of happiness, that it's an intrinsic element of happiness, not something separate from happiness. So he insists that happiness is the fundamental goal that all people seek, and insofar as they seek other things, they seek them as part of happiness. We don't have to explore that in great detail. I'm not sure exactly how important that is or not, actually. But it's a way of keeping straight and narrow on the notion of the greatest happiness principle as the fundamental moral imperative as to how human beings ought to act, while opening up the question of what is it that human beings desire and what is happiness for individuals and human beings. And in this context, yes?
He's driven, it sounds like he's putting quantitative value on happiness. You cannot do that. Was he driven by the strictness of his dad, of his education?
Well, he's trying to counter that, actually. It is Bentham and James Mill who really do have this notion that James Mill following in Jeremy Bentham's direction, that it is basically all that happiness is basically the sum of one's pleasures, and pleasures are one's felt satisfactions. You can just call it sensual satisfactions or felt satisfaction, whatever you want to give to it. It's not really developed in a great detail. It's like if you have a pleasure, you know it almost, right? But the approach of that then is empirical from Bentham's point of view, objective, and the way you can do that is by quantifying it. That's how you would evaluate as to what is the best policy. It's the policy which leads to the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. Again, treating each person as one and no one as more than one. That's an important proviso. It's not clear, by the way, how one would justify that proviso. Let's get carried away there. What's the rational justification? One could argue, for example, well, but people are not equal. Some people are better than others, and they ought to get more pleasure or more votes. There's such a thing as weighted voting. Actually, John Stuart Mill was sympathetic to the notion of weighted voting. If you didn't have an adequate education, your vote shouldn't count as much. He did have that argument in representative government. So if you can say that, you can say, wait a second, why does each person's pleasure count as equally to all others? When, some people live the lives, if I can get carried away a little bit and say, some people's lives are closer to that of pigs and others closer to those of Socrates. I don't get carried too far on that. But if you can see a qualitative difference in the lives of people, then why is it the case that each person's pleasures should count equally? Well, I don't know that Bentham really has a sophisticated philosophical justification of that, but it is central to his principle. And Mill really, in some interesting way, is committed to that notion also, that all people ought to be respected. You see, but if you're a deontologist like Immanuel Kant, that's almost self-evident. That's built into the categorical imperative, that you always treat rational nature as an end in itself, never solely as a means. That means all people ought to be treated with equal fundamental basic respect. That's a matter of the categorical imperative. He thinks he has a rational justification for that as a universal demand, which creates an obligation. It's a right all people have, which creates an obligation. But you see, with John Stuart Mill, all rights, all obligations are derivative from what is the good. That's the profound difference between consequentialists and deontologists. What is really fundamental? And for a consequentialist such as Mill, what is fundamental is human pleasure, human happiness. Maybe more, we want in a modern way to expand that to human satisfactions. I'll leave that as an open question of whether that's a legitimate move or not, because people can get satisfaction from all kinds of strange things. I mean, we can think of all kinds of people who got strange degrees of satisfaction. So that's not so obvious, okay? But putting that aside, that is the intellectual, the moral framework for the utilitarian, is that whatever be your obligations, what is right and what is just, it has to be derivative from what consequences follow from seeking the maximization of human happiness. That is the ultimate foundation. And then Mill argues in complicated ways and nicely and interestingly that it's perfectly fair for human beings to develop a concern for justice. He thinks it's desirable, it's valuable, and it's valuable for people to actually be committed emotionally to justice and to be committed emotionally to virtue as motives for your action. But the justification of those motives is because being committed to justice is most likely to expand and improve the collective well-being of human beings in the long run. And you get a development that is often a distinction often between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. And to put it again, to get simple and make it clear, act utilitarianism says what the fundamental moral injunction is that every one of your acts should seek to enhance the collective well-being of all. But that's very difficult for us to do, for us to know, for example, what will be the likely consequences of this act or that act. So it's really difficult. It may well be the ultimate rationale in Mill's sense, but in a practical sense, it's difficult for it to be our daily way of operating. So it is much more likely to be successful in the long run. Human well-being is most likely to be advanced in the long run if people develop the character and the attitudes dictated by the desire for justice and for virtue. Those are motives which are most likely to produce the right choices in the short run and to contribute to the greatest happiness for the greatest number in the long run, even if in specific situations they may not give rise to the best act now. But it would only be in exceptional circumstances that one should violate these moral rules, as it were, these secondary moral rules, which are basically useful in the long run, but one should violate them rarely, only in extreme conditions where it's obviously the case that to follow through with them would have negative consequences. Let me just give you a simple example. I mean, oversimplified. Right? It is perfectly a good moral rule, not of the highest virtue, but to tell the truth and not lie. Not lie to people that you care about, certainly. And yet, there are situations. There's always had the example, of the Gestapo coming to the door and saying, Frank's, is he upset if there's any Jews in there? And, well, from Kant's point of view, absolutely you do not lie. And there's a long discussion as to why. Never right to lie. It's something which most of us would feel, wait a second, that's really kind of rigid. That seems like a perfect case where, yes, I respected the obligation to tell the truth, certainly to people I know or care about, but in general, to people in general. It's morally obligatory. That's a right rule, but it's clear that in this case, I should break it. And I think most people would feel that way. So that kind of distinction is built in, says Mill. There's reason why secondary rules developed, and that's useful. That's nothing inconsistent, he thinks, with respect to his utilitarianism. These rules are things we ought to follow. The ought comes in here. We ought to follow throughout most of our life, most of the time, and only in exceptional circumstances should we violate them. But it is legitimate to violate them in those exceptional circumstances, because the only full, final justification of these rules is because they contribute in the long run to the greatest happiness, to the greatest number, and in specific circumstances, they may not be doing that. Yes.
I'm interested in what you said about Kant.
Yeah.
Did he believe in a singular rule? In other words, that there was only one rule to apply to that circumstance of Gestapo knocking at the door?
Yes, basically.
Except the conflict rule.
The answer is basically yes. It can get a little more complicated, but it's the categorical imperative, which is what is central for Kant. And the categorical imperative, which, by the way, is being categorical, meaning, it's not an alternative. It is a direct, he contrasts that with a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is if you want something, let's say you want health, then eat this food and not that food, right? So the imperative, eat this food and not that food. Let's say follow the Mediterranean diet rather than processed foods. That's an imperative tells you this is, you should do that, but it's hypothetical. You should do that if and only if you want this objective. The categorical imperative has no if there. It is an imperative that is universally binding on all rational creatures. That's his claim. Now, where does he get that from? And I can't go into great detail on Kant, but there are different versions of it. All right. One is act such that you could wish without contradiction that the maxim of your act were a universal law binding on all people. The maxim of your act being the rationale behind your act. And the second one is always treat rational nature, basically human beings, but if there are other rational beings, them also, always treat human beings as ends in themselves, never solely as means. You can treat them as means. You take a bus, the bus driver is a means to you getting someplace, but you must always respect, you must treat them not simply as an instrument or a tool. Instruments or tools are simply means and do not have intrinsic value for Kant. But rational natures, in this case, basically human beings, have intrinsic value following from their intrinsic nature. That's a long argument that he tries to give as to what is the ground of the obligation, right? For Kant, therefore, the ground of the obligation is built into the very nature of rationality. And it is the overriding moral framework. So duty and obligation are fundamental and consequences are secondary. What is relevant is what is your intention? And if your intention is one, so he begins one of his famous essays by saying the only thing that is intrinsically valuable is the goodwill. The goodwill is the will to act in accordance with the categorical imperative, regardless of the consequences. That's the only thing that's intrinsically valuable. That's where Kant is coming from. You have to ask yourself, in the more general sense, what does it mean to say one ought to do something? What does it mean to say you have a duty or an obligation to do something? And the question would come, wait a second, where does that duty or obligation come from? For Kant, he thinks it's intrinsic to the very nature of our being. For John Stuart Mill, it is always secondary. It is always derivative. And that's part of the challenge and criticism of the utilitarians, potentially anyway. So that he can recognize duty or obligation, but only as a secondary rule. A good way of functioning by and large for the most part, except under extreme circumstances, because it, he argues, contributes to the real goal, which is the good being, right? The promoting the greatest happiness for the greatest number, with each person counting as one and no one counting as more than one. But that last part, it's not clear where he gets that from. Clear where Kant would get it from. It's not clear where Mill will get that from, except that he's basically a decent person and feels like we ought to treat people with respect. But it doesn't follow necessarily why would not the happiness of the majority, I don't know, of sensitive, caring people be more important than even if bought at the expense of the suffering of the criminals. Let me vastly make a simple thing. Yes.
Isn't the notion of the greater good subject to interpretation?
That depends on your criteria. That's the point. That's the point. Yes. What is the frame of your interpretation? Right? What is the frame of your interpretation? Is the greatest good quantitative pleasure on the part of each autonomous individual? That's what Bentham is talking about. And it's not clear. It's not a matter of interpretation there. By the way, we're not that far from Bentham, because Bentham's analysis is really, in philosophy, the equivalent of our contemporary use of cost-benefit analysis. That's all it is. It's the exact same mode of thinking. So we use cost-benefit analysis. Some of our laws require us to use cost-benefit analysis, for example, when the Environmental Protection Agency is going to make decisions with respect to the cleanup of the plume in Bethpage, and discussions as to, well, what is its obligations, what is its responsibility, to what level do we have to do the cleanup, how much is it going to cost, what is the benefit? That's just Bentham. It's no different. Except that Bentham is doing it at a philosophical level, and he's saying that what really matters is, if you do that analysis, are you producing the greatest happiness or the greatest number, where we're talking about the pleasure of people in the very direct sense. Now, are we satisfied with cost-benefit analysis? And there are people who are not fully satisfied, because some things don't have a cost. Some things are not quantifiable. That's the argument, in part, right? There is much discussion about whether everything can be quantifiable. Mill thinks, no, it's not all quantifiable. Well, then now your question comes back. Well, then what's the criteria? And are we reduced to subjective preferences? Do we have as a society an obligation to take taxpayer money and fund public television? I have a feeling that issue is going to be discussed in the near future again. There are people in the society who have made a strong effort to try and privatize public television, and others who have fought to defend public television as somehow an intrinsic benefit. But does it make money? Well, it depends on your criteria, but I would assume it is not as profitable as different ways of using those resources. So this is really, we're talking about Bentham and we're talking about Mill, but we're not operating in some other realm. This is relevant to the way in which human beings in society operate, even if it's not made as clear as specific. And cost-benefit analysis is basically what Bentham is doing, and Mill is doing it too in a more nuanced way. But in being more nuanced, he may be he's certainly being a little less precise. Okay, that maybe is what reality requires. Maybe that is a confusion. It's not clear how one therefore relates qualities and quantities, and what criteria one uses. So Mill does come with an argument, clearly. He's got to say, all right, well, if quality matters here, how do we determine what qualities are significant? And how do we weigh them? So his answer, the answer he gives in Utilitarianism is, well, the only way to value that is to look to people who have experienced both. Let me say pushpin and opera, if I may use those extremes, okay? But you could take any different runs. Look at people who experienced extensive sensual pleasure, and look at people who've experienced extensive also intellectual pleasure, and they have experienced both, right? If they have experienced both, then what do they choose? That is the best criteria we can have. He offers that as a criteria to evaluate which pleasures are qualitatively more significant and preferable, and therefore to be valued more than others. And that's it. Is that an adequate criteria, or is that one which is biased from his intellectual point of view, or based on David's comment last week? Is that one which is an expression of a certain kind of intellectual imperialism vis-a-vis the third world or other cultures?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
It seems that notion of justice or virtue adds a morality to the utilitarianism that makes it not just numbers. The example I was thinking is, if there's two rowboats and one has 4 people in it and one has 1.
Yeah.
The greatest good, and you can only save one. The greatest good would be to save the rowboat with 4 people in it. But if the 4 people were, I don't know, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot, then, then the overriding sense of justice or virtue, as you say, the poor guy in the other boat who isn't those.
Yeah,
things.
those are the kinds of examples that one often gives. Some of the classic examples that have been discussed in ethics classes are somewhat like that, is you're on a train or trolley car is the example usually used. I guess it's developed years ago. And you're in a trolley car and there's someone, there's one, I don't know, there's a person right in front of you who you could push off and he'd kill him, but that would save these 4 people that you were going to get hit. Or you could but this person hasn't done anything wrong, or you could not do that and let the trolley car go and hit these 4 people and kill them. You know, what choice do you, and there were numerous variations of that. And the usual experience, by the way, when people are asked in different ways, they tend to choose the one of killing the one person instead of the 4, but not if they have to physically push them. There's actually been there are a lot of examples of actually doing the different forms of these as tests. And the actual act of having to push them is usually an impediment that people can't do, but they can make the mathematical choice by and large. And that's kind of a utilitarian weighing simply of numbers.
Yeah, but those are kind of
We don't know anything about the
honest
people.
as opposed
We-
to one anonymous person.
That's right. We don't know anything about, then you start bringing in qualitative questions.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Mill, by the way, does so in a strange kind of way because, as I said, in the representative government, he talks about weighted voting. Weighted voting where not everybody's vote counts the same. Because he thinks that people with an education of some sort, depending on how you're understanding what is the relevant education and how much of it and all those other questions that have to be addressed. But he's arguing that those people's vote should count more. I think if that had the case in America, Harris would have been elected as opposed to Trump based on the polls, right? So you can make an argument for that, et cetera, okay? But that's strange because in some sense, he argues that we're still treating each person as valuable. But it's not quite the same to say, well, yeah, but your vote doesn't count as much as his. That doesn't seem to me, there's a weighting here which suggests, wait a second, he's more valuable than you are for some reason. So there's an ambiguity there, and I can see where Mill is coming from. And I can understand what the dynamic is. Right? But he's trying hard to really address real problems. His philosophy is not what we might call ivory tower philosophy. He's concerned with the real problems of science, of society, of social policies and programs. And I want to go now, not because we've exhausted the topic of utilitarianism, but I think you have some sense of what's at stake here, to the way Mill seeks to apply his consequentialist utilitarianism to the question of human liberty and human freedom on liberty. And I'm going to begin that with a quote that he starts with. Where is my, okay. Oh, here we are. So let me read this long quote, but I think it really sets the framework, and I'll try to get the essence of the challenge that he poses here. He says, the object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle as entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of a compulsion and control. So society, when can and should society control or compel individuals, and when not? One single principle, he thinks, is really at the root here. Whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. And as I said, he felt that strongly for many reasons, not the least of which, of course, being the complications that he experienced personally in his relation with Harry Taylor, which it was not legality that primarily was the problem. He did nothing that was illegal, but he did much that was subject to the criticism in many ways of the social worlds of which he was a part. Yeah. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their members is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. That's the key notion, the harm principle. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinion of others, to do so would be wise or even right. These are good reasons for remonstrating with him, or reasoning with him, or persuading him, or entreating him, but not for compelling him, or visiting him with any evil in case he do otherwise. To justify that, the conduct from which it is desired to deter him must be calculated to produce evil to someone else. The only part of the conduct of anyone for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. Now, in this passage, right, Mill distinguishes paternalistic and moralistic restrictions of liberty from restrictions on liberty upon the harm principle, and claims that the harm prevention is the sole legitimate basis for restricting individual liberties. To restrict someone, if it to be for their own benefit, is paternalistic. To restrict them on the basis of your judgment of morality is moralistic. But to restrict them because what they're doing would create harm to someone else is legitimate. And a little step further on this, Mill distinguishes harm from offense. So as to clear, because the real question was, well, then what do you mean by harm? You know, what do you mean by harm? There are all kinds of ways, and Mill understands, and this becomes the complication, etc. This is not so clear because in a certain sense, everything we do affects others. The only way that wouldn't be the case is if we lived, you know, someplace in the woods by ourselves or on a different planet. So everything we do in some ways affects others. The question becomes, so you can't, it doesn't, there's no rational discussion here if we're talking about any kind of influence, but most influences are secondary or not. They're societal. Well, there are different kinds. So one distinction he makes is between harm and offense. For example, you know, if I was a sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never harm me. You probably heard that when you were a kid or something. I don't know. I've heard that many times. It's really not quite so simple, obviously. Anybody involved in psychotherapy understands the complexities of that. And then we've had all these different discussions about different forms of harassment in the workplace and language and the effect that it can have. I don't want to oversimplify this issue. But there is some difference that Mill thinks is important between offenses and harms. Physically, we can figure what harm is very directly. If it's physical, there are other forms of harm. But yes,
I can spit on the floor. That's offensive.
that's right.
Nobody's home.
That's right. Right.
Yeah,
So usually one way of thinking about this is in terms of what a person has a right to. For example, if we were in competition, this is an example he uses, competition for a job, all right, and I get the job, you are clearly in some sense harmed, all right, but it's not, it's a legitimate result of a process we both engaged in, and it's a natural result of that interaction. It is not it's not that you had a right to that job. So the question is, to what does one have a right? If I have a right to something, then if that right is infringed, then I am clearly illegitimately harmed. So Mill makes that connection between that which we have a right to, and that gets us back to the whole notion of utilitarianism in some sense of and how we create rights and how we justify them. And Mill will accept that we have rights as secondary rules because that enhances the society, and he talks about why that's justified. But that's where the notion of justice fits in. Justice is precisely the respecting of the rights that people have, and the violation of that is clearly a harm which is punishable. But I do not have a right to your helping me if I am in trouble, for example. You may have an obligation in some sense to generally help people who are in trouble, but you don't have a specific obligation to help that specific person. And that specific person does not have a right which obliges me. So if someone falls into the water, it's sort of a supererogatory moral action to try and save the person. But if you don't choose to do so for whatever reason, that person didn't have a right to demand it or expect it of you. You have a sort of, from Mill's point of view, you sort of a general right to be helpful to others when possible, but you do not have a specific obligation to help a specific person in a specific case, unless that person has a specific right for that. So Mill argues, and he's trying to develop criteria. So what's the purpose of philosophical investigation here? It's not to solve a specific issue. It is to create a series of criteria by which we can organize our lives and guide ours so we know what is the relevant questions to ask and what are the criteria by which to evaluate them. So he argues, and we can debate each one of these things. He argues that we do have a collective obligation to give testimony at a trial if we're called upon. Now well, do we have, and then he tries to give an argument to explain why collectively it's important. Society has a right to demand that, as it has a right to demand its members to pay taxes, to support its police and its institutions of self-government. And so we can argue is what one has a right to or not, what society has, what legitimate claims it can have or not. He says that, for example, but it has not a right to engage in stopping homosexuality, prostitution. Those are not It can have a right to control where it can happen. But these are,
Stopping the suicide.
I don't know what Mill's position on that is, to be truthful. It's a good question. I assume he has addressed that someplace. I don't know the answer to that question, so I can't, it's a good question. All right, the suicide. Certainly a classic in the Stoics, you know, the door is always open, as Marcus Aurelius would say. But I don't know what, of course, in the Christian tradition, one doesn't have it because God, somehow your life is really God's gift to you, and you have an obligation, therefore, not to dispense with it. I don't know what Mill's position is. It's a good question, and it's legitimate, and I assume he has addressed it. My ignorance, I don't know. Right? But then you can say, well, how would we go about talking about that? Well, what are my obligations to whom? And you could say, well, what are my obligations to myself? Why should my choice of decision for myself, that's self-regarding, why does anyone else have a right to tell me what to do or not to do? And he certainly argues very strongly for the right to pursuing one's own life in one's own way. I want to get to that. Time does not allow a full extensive discussion. I wanted to point out there were really three dimensions of this argument. Let me explain them so that we can see what's involved here. There are three dimensions of that. One is freedom of thought. Number two is freedom of lifestyle. And three is freedom really of association and action. And the arguments for each one are different. Those are sort of the three major dimensions of liberty that he is concerned to addressing. Okay? And the argument for freedom of thought and expression, thought has got to also involve your ability to say or write things. Number two, freedom of lifestyle. And third, freedom of association, with whom you associate, and that means also what you engage in and do. And he presents his arguments, and that one is clearly more constrained. There are more precise qualifications on that. And then he has a whole discussion which tries to say, how would you implement that? And his implementation, you could accept all of his arguments and take disagreement with the way he chooses to apply them. But then you would have to have a rational explanation as why his applications are inadequate. For example, on prostitution, for example, or on pornography, or on any other self-regarding or other regarding action. And suicide is a relevant question here. Is that a self-regarding action? Or is it other regarding action? Well, it might depend. It might depend, for example, on not just on you and your lifestyle, but other people and their dependence on you or not. And is that self-chosen or not? And we could explore what would be the relevant considerations which might constrain you morally from doing that action. And you can see the way in which Mill's thought would guide us. And that's the important thing to understand about philosophy, right? Philosophy does not answer the questions, but it tends, when it's working well, as it were, it helps us understand how to think about things. It provides a coherent and rationally defensible perspective in assisting the way we address specific issues and all issues, depending on how comprehensive your philosophical approach is. And that surely is true with Mill. So he's trying to argue and set a framework for the way society ought to deal with individuals with respect to their freedom of speech and expression, with respect to their lifestyles, and with respect to their modes of association and action. And he was very much influenced in this context by Alexis de Tocqueville, famous for Democracy in America, which was published in 1835 and again in volume 2 in 1840. And Mill knew de Tocqueville, was very much impressed by him. And most particularly is to Tocqueville, who expresses the concern about the tyranny of the majority. And Mill was concerned about that. And you can see that operating because he's talking not primarily about the role of government. He's aware of the history of oppressive governments. And in the context of the British tradition, really, he thinks that issue has been more or less addressed. Certainly in the British tradition. Going back to the Magna Carta, etc., numerous struggles which have led to the emergence in the British tradition of representative government in which the people have an effective say, in principle, in determining the policies and controlling the actions of their government. So clearly in the 19th century, among the major concerns and struggles politically were the struggles as who gets representative, who gets to represent, to vote. And there were several reform acts, and Mill was involved in the struggles for the second Reform Act to expand the franchise. Clearly, it did not include women, even though he tried, but it did expand the possibilities of working people and increase the representation of the urban areas. So we could talk about the progress that was made and the limitations in representative government, but the notion was, by and large, oppressive government has been the issue of the threats of oppressive government, which did exist, has more or less been solved. But what has not been solved is the process of, we might call it Victorian morality in a certain sense, but the process by which a majority imposes its morals and values on the society as a whole and tends to squash down creativity, imagination, variation, distinct lifestyles, which again, as I said, Mill experienced personally in his relation with Harriet Taylor. But you can think of it that for him, it was extremely important that a society facilitate the possibility of experimentation in lifestyles. And that issue is really what is in some sense central to On Liberty. Because Mill is so committed to the value of the promotion of individuality, which is, as I think I mentioned this last time, to be distinguished from and not confused with the doctrine of individualism. The doctrine of individualism is a metaphysical doctrine about the nature of reality. What is reality constituted of? The doctrine of individuality is a value in celebrating the distinctness and uniqueness of each and every individual's possibilities. So Mill is an atomistic individualist in the way on which I suggested before when I contrasted him with Auguste Comte, and I think there are significant limitations in his metaphysical conception of the nature of the individual and the individual's relation to society and the way society functions. But that is separate from his value, his ideal, which is the celebration of human potential. And he speaks about the importance of facilitating the development of the human being as the realization of human potential, as an ideal, and the importance of a society which supports and sustains that ideal with the variations that it requires. That goes to part two of the three things he wants, namely the right to pursue one's own individual lifestyle in one's own way. That for him is essential value, which one can argue with and obviously disagree, because if you allow and encourage these variations in lifestyle, you end up with all kinds of strange kinds of behaviors and activities. It's not nearly as comfortable, certainly not as easily controllable. And it certainly invites all kinds of variations which might then be to some people offensive. Invariably, there will be behavior and activity which will be offensive to others. But offensive is not harm. At what point does offense become harm? That becomes an interesting question. But from Mill's point of view, what he's showing is these are different criteria. So even if you don't agree with the way he applies them, if you're operating within the Mill framework, you're asking yourself, wait, what is yes, harm is a legitimate reason for stopping a person's for compelling another. Offense is not a legitimate reason for stopping a person's behavior. Now, is this offense or not? And what are the criteria for offense or harm? That you're thinking in a Millian framework, even if your conclusion practically is somewhat different. And that's quite understandable. I've certainly not answered your question because I don't know the answer. And I don't want to act as if I do.
Sounds like Mill would approve of the notion of the American Electoral College, which is designed to prevent the tyranny of the majority.
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, it's a form of weighted voting. Let's put it that way, all right? I said he clearly, so he might or might not approve of that way of doing it, but he would not necessarily disapprove of the principle of weighting the vote. But there might be reasons why that way of doing it is not the best, because it doesn't maximize the well-being of people, it has negative consequences. That I don't know. I mean, so I don't know that Mill ever really addressed that question specifically, but it's certainly a legitimate question and is right in the context of Millian thought, right? Is that way of weighing the vote, the Electoral College, a legitimate or not legitimate way of addressing the question of quality in the determination of social policy or political policy in this one? So we can be in the Millian framework, which is a useful one, by the way. If we are going to be let's say in the simplest sense, if we're going to be a libertarian or a liberal in the classical sense, using those words loosely now, then we're really going to operate to some extent within a Millian framework. To the extent to which we are liberal, libertarian or something, we're operating within a Millian framework, however varied that might be. And that can be carried over, because even late in his life, he referred to himself as a social democrat or a socialist, though his conception of it was not Marxian socialism. It was really social democracy. And that really, I think it's fair to say, under the influence of Harriet Taylor, who was more politically engaged and really more, I think, emotionally invested in moral reform. That's not perhaps quite right, but I think she contributed significantly to Mill's political engagements, to the progressive nature of Mill's political engagements. Certainly, she contributed indirectly as much as directly to his views on the subjugation of women, because he had very good reason to believe that it was in his own personal life that it was an impediment. And when he married her, he specifically came along with I think it was a codicil that went to the agreement that he abjured all of the official rights which were given to males at that time. Women couldn't have property, go on and on. I mean, and he just simply, he wrote that down so that she was not in any way constrained legally, because that was built into the legal structure of marriage in 1851 in Britain. So, okay, where are we now? We're running, well, we got a few minutes left. So let me this is sort of a kind of brief summary, okay? Here's for the first chapter. Long statement, but I think it sets it forth nicely. This is chapter 2. There were, chapter 1 does a discussion of the history of the struggles for freedom and deals with the political history, and we've solved that problem, and now we get the problem of the emergence of the middle class and emergence of a kind of ethics of equality, which is what de Tocqueville talks about. And that means basically that everybody has a right to have a say. And that wasn't true in the aristocratic era, right? There would, if you go to the French Ancien Regime before the French Revolution, there were three classes: the nobles, the clergy, and the vast majority of the people. And some of them paid taxes and some of them didn't pay taxes. And they had different laws, etc. And Voltaire found that out, unfortunately, when he challenged one of the nobles to a duel. And he ended up being beaten and put in jail and then kicked out of the country. So that was, you don't, if you're part of the rabble, you don't challenge a noble to a duel. And whatever your friends are, however nice they are, they're not going to take your side against this noble. And he found that out to his surprise and misfortune. Though fortunately, we must say historically, the fact is, it's very good that the guy didn't take him up in the duel, because we would never have had Voltaire. I mean, he would not have been able to. He was taking lessons on swordsmanship. Not a smart move. Not a smart move. Anyway, fortunately, they didn't. The noble wouldn't take him up on that. Just had his friends beat him up, and then had him put in jail. And when he agreed to leave the country and go to England, they let him out after several months. Anyway, so chapter first on the liberty of thought and discussion, which is chapter 2 then. First, if any opinion is compelled to silence, that opinion may, for all we can know, be true. I mean, by the way, this entire argument, he tries to present it justified by utilitarianism. So he abjures, he says, any claim to natural rights like Jefferson has. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Bentham says that's absurdity. That's madness on stilts or something. He's on with that. No, we're talking about, so his argument is really always a utilitarian argument. Not quite as easy to make an argument for liberty on consequentialist grounds. It's easier to make it on grounds of natural right, and everybody has a right to things. But the question of what kind of justification one can give for natural rights is not empirical, that's for sure. Anyway, first, if any opinion is compelled to silence, that opinion may, for all we can know, certainly know, might be true. To deny this is to assume our own infallibility. That's one reason why we shouldn't suppress an opinion. It might be true. Secondly, though, the silenced opinion, though the silenced opinion be in an error, it may, and very commonly does, contain a portion of truth. And since the general or prevailing opinion on any subject is rarely or never the whole truth, it is only by the collision of adverse opinions that the remainder of the truth has any chance of being supplied. So we want to suppress the opinion, but it may be wrong, but it may have part of the truth. It usually does, to some extent. Thirdly, even if the received opinion be not only true, but the whole truth, that's what we now believe, and someone is challenging it, unless it is suffered to be and actually is vigorously and earnestly contested, it will, by most of those who receive it, be held in the manner of a prejudice, with little comprehension or feeling of its rational grounds. So even if what we believe is the right thing, we won't really appreciate it. We won't understand what it really means if we don't have to, in some sense, defend it from criticism. But fourthly, the meaning of the doctrine itself will be in danger of being lost or enfeebled and deprived of its vital effect on the character and conduct. The dogma becoming a mere formal profession, as I think many people feel about democracy. Yeah, we're in favor of democracy. No one knows what the hell it means, and no one really cares, and it doesn't really affect our daily life. Inefficacious for good, but cumbering the ground and preventing the growth of any real and heartfelt conviction from reason or personal experience. So in sum, a censored opinion might be true. Even if literally false, a censored opinion might contain part of the truth. Even if wholly false, a censored opinion would prevent true opinions from becoming dogma. We'd have to learn how to defend them. And as a dogma, an unchallenged opinion will lose its very meaning. We don't even know what it means anymore. And I think that does happen. It has happened. So that's the summary, very quickly, of why we shouldn't suppress opinions. But now, more generally, the freedom to pursue tastes, provided they do no harm to others, even if they are deemed immoral. Further, a society ought to attempt to promote individuality, as it is a prerequisite for creativity and diversity. Now, this is the value here of lifestyles, why it's important. Quote, "It is really of importance not only what men do, but also what manner of men they are that do it. Among the works of men which human life is rightly employed in perfecting and beautifying, the first in importance surely is man himself. Human nature is not a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it, but a tree which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides according to the tendency of the inward forces which make it a living thing. The necessity of nurturing human creativity, the importance of celebrating that diversity as a possibility of developing human character. It's a sense in which this is almost here, not so much a utilitarian argument, though it is in some sense, but recapitulates a little bit of Aristotle's conception of the importance of virtue, an ethics which celebrates the quality and character of individuals as being really the central issue. And Mill is, touching base with it, as it were, here. He's doing it on a purely utilitarian basis, but he's thinking that this is what's involved in really appreciating human possibility. And there is that's he's got to argue in some sense for that. You have to talk about why he thinks individuality, celebrating the uniqueness, the unique possibilities of each individual, is a value justifiable on a utilitarian basis as a reason not to impede or constrain experiments in lifestyles, is what he's talking about. Over and beyond opinion now. Opinion is one. He makes a clear, detailed argument as why we should not be suppressing anyone's thought, and that means anyone's ability to speak and write, because thought in one's head is not sufficient. So that was all part one. But part two is the argument for individuality, for the celebration of human capacities, and the vision of the human being as a progressive being capable of being nurtured into diversity and creativity and contributions to human well-being that follow from such. And one can make all kinds of arguments to suggest, for example, the extent to which innovation, for example, is important for a society. But innovation requires, technological as well as social and cultural, requires an openness to experimentation. And experimentation does not guarantee ever that each experiment, as it were, will be successful, worthwhile, or not, in fact, offensive in some ways to different people. Certainly lifestyle opportunities and activities will be offensive to different people. Offense is not harm. At what point does offense become harm? It's a complicated questions. The criteria for evaluating Mill is presenting and rationales for how to think about them, and then it's for you to apply. The last one is the most complicated, because Mill understands that once we engage in interactions with people, associations and actions, the criteria are much more specific as to the consequences that they have on others. All actions are going to be actions in society, obviously directly impinging upon others. And that's where that's where he gets some detailed applications of how he would apply his thoughts about the requirements, for example, of contributing to the national defense, contributing to the taxes, having an obligation to give testimony in a court of law when called upon, and other kinds of, he believes also we have an obligation to contribute to the general education. That was quite you say that was not universally accepted in 18 on liberty is 1859. Interesting year, by the way, 1859. That's the year of the publication of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. It's also the year of the birth of John Dewey, probably America's greatest philosopher. And it's also on the verge of the Civil War in the United States. So there we get to the real question of distinguishing between harm and offense. So as notes I have here, it says a basic philosophical problem presented by the work is what counts as harm to others. Where should we mark the boundary between conduct that is principally self-regarding versus conduct that involves others? Does drug use cause harm to others sufficient to be prevented? That's a big issue right now. Some societies have tried to legalize all forms of drugs. Oregon tried that basically, and has now backed off it. Portugal has been doing it. I'm not sure exactly where they are at the moment. We certainly have not, by and large, though recently we've removed marijuana from the Schedule A of enforcement, but we still, and of course we have some serious problems with drug use, clearly. So where should we mark the boundary between conduct that is principally self-regarding versus conduct that involves others? Does drug use cause harm to others sufficient to be prevented? Does prostitution, pornography, should polygamy be allowed? How about public nudity? Though these are difficult questions, Mill provides the reader with a principled way of deliberating about them. He distinguishes between harm and mere offense. To constitute a harm, an action must be injurious or set back important interests of particular people, interests in which they have rights. And that's usually the way he links that connection. His real focus is on non-consensual harm. I mean, consensual harm would be, for example, choosing to be a boxer. You're consenting to get harmed. There's no question about that. You're going to get harmed. However much depends, really. But you're going to get harmed, but you consent to that for whatever reason. So that's not a problem. But it may be other kind of problem. Why would you consent to it, or how you feel about boxing, or is that a function of the only way that the lower class people can make their way into success? I mean, there's all kinds of other issues you can raise about that and other things, but it's it's non-consensual. Further, Mill's position is that causing harm is always a legitimate reason to raise questions about compulsion. Anything that causes harm offers a potentially legitimate reason. The question becomes, wait a second, right? Are you harming another who has a right not to be? Are you harming another in a way in which, well, what would be the other consequences? Well, there may be conditions in which trying to stop the harm would produce worse consequences. Again, the judgment is always consequences, cost-benefit analysis in some sense. And you could think of things like vaccines, absolutely, vaccines. I was thinking of fracking, but you can make, there are numerous examples where we can say, wait, and it's not always clear what the consequences are, what the results are, right? So there are numerous social policies which are not pure in the sense of having no negative consequences. Do we know all of the consequences or the major or most likely ones? That's one question. Number two, what are the benefits and how well can we understand what they are? Okay. And then how do we weigh these things? And this is obviously real world issues that Mill is talking about. He's not, but he's giving us a way to think about it, which I think is an interesting and constructive way. It's not necessarily the only way to think about it, but it is certainly a way which is consistent with Anglo-Saxon culture, let me say, and certainly operative in our society to a greater or lesser extent. It's not the only thing that's involved. There are in particular groups that have interests and vested interests in different points of view. And so often their way of approaching it is not an impartial way, but you can often simply say, wait a second, when they approach it, they have to bring reasons which appeal outside of their preferences. Not, well, we're in favor of this development because we're real estate developers, or we're construction workers, just to take both sides of that political equation. No, the argument has got to be something that really appeals to the general well-being. Say, well, we have not enough housing, or we need to have this road, or we need to have these lithium batteries installed so as to make possible for the development of alternative energy. I mean, we can go on, or we can talk about vaccines, etc. And of course, vaccines is a big notion. There are all kinds of, the argument could go for some versus, you might make intelligent distinctions between which vaccines under which conditions for what reasons. That gets more complicated. So the way of thinking that Mill developed seems to me makes really coherent sense. And it's really, but it's based on the notion of the valuing each individual's capacities and possibilities. I think the limitation of it is to do with the extent to which he is really a kind of atomic individualist, an individualist, which is different from the celebration of the individuality. I think his conception of the human being and the social dimension of our existence is, I think, limited in important ways, and how that would affect the application of his theory is a more complicated question. And that's why I think a better and improved development of his utilitarianism is to be found in the work of John Dewey and American pragmatism. But because I think Dewey and his colleague George Herbert Mead have a richer conception of the social nature of the human self and of the operation of society. But I think Mill is an extremely important contribution to this. All right, I think we're overdone. Thank you very much.